Rodgers gets the snap. Blitz is on. Rodgers scrambles left, winds up rainbow.
Cobb.
He's got Cobb at the 10 to the 5
Yes!
to the end zone. Touchdown and a dagger. Oh my goodness! An NFC North Division Championship dagger.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to Real Packers Talk, the podcast dedicated to everything green and gold. I am your host, Ethan Peltier. You can find me anywhere on Instagram or Twitter at Real Packers Talk. Additionally, you can find the podcast on both YouTube, Spotify, and Anchor. I'm back today to continue my prospect profile series. Today, I'll be covering Jayden Reed, our second round selection in this year's draft. He is a wide receiver out of the Michigan State University. And like I've talked about with the other prospects so far, I will go over his brief overview, some strengths, weaknesses. I'll touch on the RAS score, and then I'll talk briefly about what kind of role I think he can play in this upcoming for the offense in this upcoming season. So without further ado, I'm just going to jump right into it. So during my episode a couple days ago on Luke Musgrave, I mentioned the fact that the Packers were going to need to address tight end early in the draft, early and often. I had the same sentiment for receiver, and sure enough, that's what they did. Jayden was the first of 3 receivers that they ended up taking in this draft, and I'm glad that they didn't wait very long. There was a ton of talent for this for this year's receiver class, and obviously, I've already mentioned names like Jackson Smith and Jigba, who a lot of Packers fans wanted. I wanted to say that it's okay to have guys fall to us in later rounds. There was a ton of value in this draft for the position, and I think they actually found a guy that, on paper, you might not think is a great fit in Green Bay, but the more I look at his tape and the more that I go over his characteristics as a player, I really do like this pick. So, the Packers were sitting at pick number 45, I mentioned that they had received pick 42 from the Jets in the Aaron Rodgers trade. So, here I was thinking they're going to pick right away, back-to-back almost. That didn't end up happening. They actually traded back twice, all the way back to 50, and in the process they were able to pick up I believe a couple of later-round picks, which, again, I'm not complaining about, especially in a draft where there are certain positions that aren't as deep as others. You want to be able to have as many swings at bat as possible. And I think the Packers did a really good job of managing the value that they had and maximizing it. So, if you want to look at it this way, you essentially get Jayden Reed at pick 50 plus 2 more players that you picked in later rounds. So, like I said, totally okay with this. First and foremost, though, when looking at him as a player, I have yet to go over his measurables yet, and you're probably wondering why. It's because he doesn't meet the typical Packers threshold when it comes to the type of athleticism and height/weight that they typically go for, especially for receiver. Lately, as at least in the Brian Gutekunst era, the Packers have targeted receivers that are at least 6'1" or taller. That big, tall, fast guys, kind of like your MVS's. Equinemius, St. Brown's, those are typically the bodies that they've been trying to add to this team. So this is a guy that I don't think anyone, or very few people at least, mocked to Green Bay based on the fact that he's only 5'11", and he weighs 187 pounds. So he's not a big dude for NFL standards by any means. But that's okay. I think for a while the Packers have been lacking in the slot position, that true smaller, shifty, kind of quicker than fast guy who can win over the middle with those with slants and stuff like that. I think Jayden Reed could potentially step into a role like that, and I'll talk more about that later in the episode. Like I said, I just wanted to mention he doesn't meet the Packers' typical threshold. Thought that was very interesting. Reed started his college career over at Western Michigan as a freshman, and then he ended up transferring after 1 year to Michigan State, which is where he played the next 3 years of his college career, and put up numbers on an otherwise pretty lackluster Michigan State offense. So, again, when it comes to the things that the Packers front office looks for when they're drafting these players, typically, if it's not the athleticism, it's definitely production. And Jayden Reed produced in college. I'm going to just go over his stats briefly. His freshman year, this was at Western Michigan, by the way. He had 56 receptions for 797 yards, 8 touchdowns. In 2020, this is now with Michigan State. He had 33 receptions, 407 yards for 3 touchdowns. In 2021, he went off with 59 receptions, 1,026 yards, and 10 touchdowns. And then finally in 2022, he had 55 receptions for 636 yards and 5 touchdowns. Additionally, he also had 3 punt return touchdowns while he was at Michigan State. So this guy is pretty explosive. He was a playmaker, and he was a go-to guy for his team. So these are all really good attributes to look for in a player, and I think that Jayden Reed definitely possesses that leadership ability. The fact that he was so heavily relied on throughout the course of his college career, I think it speaks volumes about him as a player. Reed brings additional value to the offense in the sense that he is versatile. I just mentioned that he had multiple punt return touchdowns during his time at Michigan State. This is a guy that you potentially could put in a punt return, kick return situation. I know that we did just re-sign Keyshawn Nixon to be our kick returner, who I expect big things from him this year. Hopefully they can get him going early and often. But Jayden Reed is definitely another guy that you can add to that mix. It doesn't hurt to have more bodies for special teams. I definitely think that Rich Bisaccia, our special teams coordinator, who's also, I think he's been promoted to assistant head coach at this point. If you ask me, he probably had something to say when it came to this selection. I'm sure he was like, well, I'm sure we could always use another punt returner, worst case scenario. And I'm okay with that. Especially since we are in such a transitional period, it really is hard to say what the expectations for the Packers are this year. Speaking of which, I probably will end up doing an episode sometime in the coming weeks about what this offense can and should look like and what to expect with Jordan Love as the starting quarterback. For now, though, I obviously have to collect my thoughts and write it all down when it comes for that episode. But to give you a little bit of sneak peek of what I'm thinking, I just don't see this team being or going out of its way to try and compete for a championship. So I think it's okay to have these guys who are a little bit more developmental pieces, guys who need to come in and play to learn, and that way we can see, what they've got. I think Jayden Reed is kind of one of those players where you got to see what you've got with him. I don't necessarily expect him to come out and wow people right away, but his versatility alone screams major upside. So now let's go over his RAS score, which it's not very high. Again, I want to stress that this is not the average player that the Packers go for at receiver. His RAS score was a whole 6.61, so not very high at all. But just because he's not necessarily a very highly graded athlete does not make him a poor football player. I've seen a lot of people point to the fact that he only ran a 4.45 40-yard dash. And again, I don't think that I don't think a 40-yard dash or a bench press or any of these tests that they do, I don't think that makes or breaks a player. Simply based on his tape alone, I would say that he probably plays faster than a 4.45 anyways. So that's not something that I'm extremely worried about. I just think it's odd that the Packers went outside of their comfort zone when it comes to the way that they draft this position. So now that I've gone over his RAS score, I want to go over the strengths and weaknesses. I'll start with strengths. The first thing I have listed is he is a quick, shifty guy. I think this is a very fun playmaker to add to this young team. I expect him and Jordan Love to, if they can get things going and develop a rapport, I expect this to be one of Jordan's go-to guys in the same way that Reed was a go-to guy at Michigan State. He can win at the high point. In fact, he is really aggressive at trying to go up and get those balls. His size does provide a little bit of a disadvantage, which I'll touch on in just a moment, but he is very competitive, and that's something that you can't teach. He's versatile, as I've mentioned already. He can play special teams if you really need him to. And then I have willing blocker written down. Not great blocker. He's not going to go out there and bully people outside with those cornerbacks and safeties. Maybe even some linebackers. But he is a willing blocker. He will get up in someone's face. And like I said, in the NFL, when he's going against these bigger defensive backs and linebackers, I don't expect him to make these blocks. But he's going to go out there and he's going to give 100% effort, which you love. You have to love that. He's definitely an effort player. Moving on to the weaknesses. Obviously, he's a little undersized. He's not the typical body that the Packers go for. So we'll see how he fits in this offense or what kind of role they try to give him. Personally, I hope they don't try to. I hope they don't treat him as if he is this 6'2", 215, 220-pound receiver who can just go out on the outside and win against 6'3" cornerbacks and stuff like that. I would hope to see him play a little bit more of a true slot role, but we'll see. I think that because of his limited size, he has a limited catch radius, which won't necessarily help him in the NFL, but it's nothing that... he's got strong hands, so as long as you can get it within his radius, I expect him to be able to come down with the ball. And then the last thing I've written as a weakness is he does need to develop his route tree. That you could probably say about almost any rookie receiver coming into the league. It's gonna be a learning curve. So it will be interesting to see if he can develop with Jordan Love. But definitely he's going to have to develop that route tree a little bit more. Not a terrible route runner, but not a great route runner yet either. Before I wrap up today's episode, I do want to say that Reed is going to get plenty of opportunities from the get-go. Going into this draft, the Packers had, I think, three receivers from last year under contract still. I could be wrong about that number. But I can, off the top of my head, it's Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, and Samori Toure. I've already mentioned that the Packers added 3 receivers in this draft, so they currently have now 6 total that they've drafted in the last 2 years. And for all we know, those could be our 6 receivers right there. And again, I'll talk about all of these things later. The point that I'm trying to make, though, is that Reed is going to come in and he's going to get plenty of snaps right away, assuming that the Packers don't go out and sign a bunch of veterans for no reason. These guys are going to get snaps, and I think that's good. Definitely should expect a learning curve, definitely should expect there to be some, drops, mistakes, those sorts of things. But this is the type of player who, he's coming into a great spot. He needs to get the playing time to develop. And I'm excited to see how he works out with Jordan Love. Him and Watson, I think, could be a fun tandem. But it really all does depend on how he develops, first of all, and how the Packers utilize him. So these are all going to be fun things to look at as the offseason continues, as we get into things like rookie minicamp, OTAs, all of that stuff. But I'm excited. I'm excited to have another pass catcher on the team. If you go and watch his highlights, I'm sure you'll find something to like. He's a fun player to watch, man. And again, if they can find the right role for him, Reed can succeed here. But yeah, I don't really have much other than that today. I forgot to mention in my last episode, before I forget, Luke Musgrave will be wearing number 88. I completely forgot to mention that. I'm sorry. Don't let me forget to mention that Jayden Reed will be wearing number 11. Initially, I think they said he was going to wear number 1, which was Curly Lambeau's old number. I don't think that's going to happen. I think they're going to hold off on that for the time being. But yeah, interesting player. Excited to learn more about him and excited to see how he fits in with this team. Thank you all so much for listening to Real Packers Talk. I appreciate you making this a part of your daily listen. You can find me again anywhere on Instagram or Twitter at Real Packers Talk. Additionally, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Anchor, and YouTube. Thank you all so much again. Have a wonderful day, evening, night, whatever it is. And as always, go Pack Go.